A woman crawled through the snow on her hands and knees. Her left hand gripped a rope frozen stiff as iron. Her right arm hung useless at her side, the shoulder wrenched and swollen beneath 3 layers of wool. She could not feel her face. She could not feel her feet. But she could still hear her daughter coughing somewhere behind her, muffled, distant, coming through the cabin wall like something fragile that might not last the night. She did not stop. The wind was not howling. It was screaming, a sound that had left ordinary weather behind and become something else entirely, something that wanted to unmake the world it moved through. The snow was not falling. It was driving, horizontal and vicious, finding every gap in her clothing and pushing ice crystals against her skin until the skin stopped reporting back. She kept her head down. She kept moving, one hand in front of the other, following the rope into the white. She could not see where she was going. She did not need to. The rope would take her there. The earth never lies. And neither did he. That was what her father used to say, standing at the edge of his land in the early mornings, looking out over the grass as if he were reading something written in a language other people had forgotten. She had not understood it then. She was beginning to understand it now. But that is not where this story begins. This story begins 7 weeks earlier, on an afternoon in late autumn when the sky was still pale blue and the cold had not yet found its teeth. She arrived with 2 cloth bags, $14, and 2 small daughters who held each other's hands and did not speak. The wagon that had carried them the last 12 miles from the nearest town stopped beside a structure so small and so beaten by weather that it took her a moment to accept that this was it. This was what her father had been living in. This was what he had left her. The cabin measured perhaps 12 feet by 16. Its walls were tar paper stretched over rough timber, the edges lifting in places where the wind had worked at them. One window faced east, cracked along the lower pane, and stuffed with rags to slow the draft. A rusted stovepipe rose through a hole in the roof, patched around with flattened tin. The door hung slightly open, as if the last person to leave had been in too much of a hurry to close it properly. Her father had not been in a hurry. He had simply run out of time. Willa Voss was 35 years old. She had been a widow for 2 years, since her husband died of a fever that moved faster than any doctor could follow. She had managed since then on seamstress work and careful arithmetic, keeping herself and her daughters, Petra, 6, and little June, 4, in a single rented room in a city that had no particular interest in whether they survived or not. When word came that her father, Einar Voss, had died on his homestead claim out on the frontier, she had faced a choice so narrow it barely qualified as one. Abandon the claim and lose the 40 acres he had spent 7 years building into something. Or go. She went. What she had not understood, not truly, not until she stood in that yard with the wind pulling at her coat and her daughters pressed against her sides, was what 7 years on a frontier claim actually looked like. There was no woodpile. Every other homestead she had passed on the wagon ride out had wood stacked along the outer walls, some modest, some enormous, all of them present. Her father's claim had nothing. No split logs, no cut timber, no kindling stacked by the door, just dead grass, a broken fence post leaning at an angle, and a stone-lined opening in the ground, 20 feet from the cabin door, covered with heavy oak planks and sealed with a brass padlock that caught the thin afternoon light and held it. The wagon driver had looked at the claim for a moment before he left. He had not said anything. He was a practical man and had learned not to say things that needed saying. But Willa had seen the look he exchanged with his horse, the slight shift of his shoulders, the way he clucked without purpose, and turned the wagon a little faster than was strictly necessary. She had understood it. She had felt it herself. She went inside the cabin and she looked at what her father had left her, and she felt, for the first time since the letter had arrived, something very close to despair. Not because the cabin was small. She had known it would be small. The letters had told her. Not because it was bare. She had expected that too. It was the smell that undid her, briefly and entirely. The particular smell of a space where someone has lived for a long time and is no longer living. Old wool and wood smoke and the faint mineral trace of water carried from far away in pails. Her father's smell, in the past tense, filling the room that was now hers. She stood in the middle of the single room and breathed it in, and she let herself have 30 seconds of grief. And then she squared her shoulders and began to take inventory. Everyone in the surrounding area had a name for that well. They called it Voss's Folly. They said old Einar had spent years digging it, lining it with fieldstone, maintaining it carefully, despite the fact that it had never produced a single drop of water. They said it was proof that the solitude had gotten to him, that a man who digs a dry well and keeps digging is a man who has lost his grip on what is real. She had believed them. She had no reason not to. The first neighbor to visit was Garrett Lund. He came that same afternoon, riding a horse that cost more than everything Willa owned combined. He was a broad man, unhurried in the way that men are unhurried when they know the situation is already decided in their favor. He had tried to buy this land from her father twice. Her father had refused both times. She knew this from the letters, though her father had never explained why Lund wanted it so badly, or why he had refused so firmly. Lund looked at the cabin. He looked at the absent woodpile. He looked at Petra and June standing behind their mother with their small faces gone careful and still. Then he looked at Willa, and he said it quietly. The way a man says something he has already decided is simply true. Your father dug that hole for 7 years and never found a drop of water. What makes you think a woman alone is going to find something he couldn't? He did not wait for an answer. He tipped his hat and rode away. Willa stood in the yard for a long time after he left. The second visitor came the following morning. Stellan Moore was 62 years old, the longest tenured farmer in that stretch of country, and he had the look of a man who had outlasted several things that should have killed him. He was not unkind. That was what made it harder. He sat at her table, turned his hat in his weathered hands, his left hand missing 2 fingers at the middle joint, old scars healed smooth as riverstone, a detail she noticed and did not ask about, and told her the arithmetic plainly. 8 cords of firewood, minimum, to survive a winter in a cabin like this. 10 would be safer. The nearest timber was miles off, cottonwood mostly, which burned fast and cold, and required nearly double the quantity to match good hardwood. He had watched strong men struggle to cut 2 cords in a month. She had 7 weeks before the serious cold arrived. Go back to wherever you came from, Mrs. Voss. His voice was not cruel. It was simply certain. The cold doesn't care about stubbornness. She thanked him for coming. She closed the door. She stood with her back against the wood and listened to his wagon move away down the frozen track. That night, after Petra and June had fallen asleep beneath every blanket she owned, Willa searched her father's coat. She had kept it folded at the bottom of one of the cloth bags, meaning to look through it properly when there was time. Now she went through every pocket, every seam, every fold of the lining, until her fingers found a small, hard shape sewn into the wool near the left shoulder. She worked the stitches loose with her sewing scissors. A brass key, worn smooth on one side from years of contact with fabric. She recognized the shape, the same key she had seen around her father's neck in an old portrait, the one she had kept on the mantel of her rented room. She had thought he had been buried with it. There was a folded paper tucked inside the same hidden seam, a single line in her father's handwriting, careful and deliberate, as if he had written it many times before getting it right. The well holds what you need. Trust what I built. She looked at the brass key for a long time. Then she looked at the door. Outside, the night was cold and the land was dark, and the well sat 20 feet away, sealed and waiting. She lit the oil lamp. She put on her coat. She crossed the frozen yard alone and knelt beside the oak planks that everyone called a dead man's vanity, and she fit the key into the padlock. It opened on the first turn. She set the planks aside and looked down into the shaft. Stone walls descended into darkness, and wooden rungs set into the masonry at careful intervals formed a ladder her father had built with his own hands. The air that rose from below was not cold. It was something else entirely, still and quiet, and holding a temperature that had no business existing 20 feet beneath a winter sky. She began to climb down, and what she found at the bottom of that shaft would change everything she thought she knew about her father, about this land, and about what it means to love someone you cannot stay with forever. The ladder had 28 rungs. Willa counted them on the way down, not because she needed to, but because counting gave her hands something to trust when her eyes had nothing. The lamp swung from her wrist on a short cord, casting moving shadows against the stone walls, and with each rung the air around her changed, losing its sharp winter edge, softening into something steadier, something that had no interest in the season happening above. At 10 feet down, the cold was already different, not gone, but quieted. At 20 feet, it was almost still. She stepped off the last rung onto packed earth and held the lamp out in front of her. The shaft was round, perhaps 4 feet across, and the walls were fieldstone laid with a care that surprised her. Not thrown together, but fitted, each stone chosen for how it met the one beside it. Her father had not been a mason by trade. He had learned this the way he learned everything, by deciding it needed to be done, and then doing it until he understood how. She almost missed the door. It was set into the eastern wall of the shaft, and it looked, at first glance, like the wall itself. The same fieldstone, the same careful laying, but one of the stones sat slightly proud of the others. Not much, perhaps the width of a finger. And when Willa pressed her palm against it, she felt it shift, deliberately, on a hinge concealed behind the mortar line. She pressed harder. The stone swung inward, and behind it was an iron ring mounted on a frame of fitted oak beams. She took the ring in both hands and pulled. The wall opened. Not the wall, a door. A door built to look exactly like the wall around it. weighted so precisely that it moved at the pressure of one hand, smooth and silent on hinges her father had kept oiled through every season. Behind it was a horizontal tunnel, low-ceilinged and timber-shored, extending away from the shaft into darkness that her lamp could not yet reach. Willa ducked through. She straightened. She walked forward 6 paces and stopped. The chamber was enormous, 16 feet wide, perhaps 20 feet long. She measured it later with careful steps, with a ceiling high enough to stand in comfortably and walls framed in timber packed with earth. The air was cool and absolutely still. Not cold. Cool. The kind of temperature that a root cellar holds in midsummer. The kind that fruit and vegetables survive the winter in. 50 degrees perhaps. Perhaps a little more. The kind of temperature that preserves everything. And the chamber was not empty. It was filled, floor to ceiling, with firewood. Split oak, arranged in rows with the careful geometry of someone who had thought deeply about airflow and drying and the slow patience required to store something properly. Each piece was roughly the same size, split to fit a stove, sized for carrying one-handed. The wood was the color of pale honey in the lamplight, dry and clean, without a trace of moisture or mold or the soft gray of rot. Willa picked up one piece and held it to her face. It smelled of nothing but wood, dry, aged, perfectly preserved wood, the kind that catches from a single match and burns hot and long and clean. She put the piece down and looked at the stacks. How far back they went, how high they were built, how many rows. She tried to calculate and stopped when the number became too large to hold casually. More than 10 cords, possibly 11. 20 tons of seasoned oak, hidden in the earth at a depth that kept it safe from frost and damp and the prying eyes of neighbors who would have claimed it for their own if they had known it existed. Her father had not lost his mind. He had dug a vault. Willa sat down on the earthen floor between the stacks of her father's oak, pulled her knees to her chest, and wept. Not the careful crying she had allowed herself in private since her husband died, the kind that ends quickly and leaves no mark. This was something older and deeper, pulled up from a place she had not known was still full. She wept for her father, who had spent 7 years building something in secret, and died before he could tell her what it was. She wept for the 7 weeks she had spent terrified, calculating odds that turned out to be different than she knew. She wept because the key had been sewn into his coat all along, and she had carried it across the country without understanding what it opened. She wept until she was empty. Then she stood up, brushed the dirt from her skirt, and began to plan. The system her father had built for hauling was mounted to a timber frame above the well opening. She found it the next morning in better light, a rope and pulley mechanism with a canvas sling large enough to hold 40 or 50 pounds of split wood. The design was simple and elegant and clearly the work of someone who had thought about the problem from every angle before committing to a solution. She could descend the ladder, load the sling in the vault, climb back to the surface, and winch the load up after her. 3 trips in a morning, perhaps 4. More on good days. The first fire she built with the oak changed everything in the cabin. For the 3 weeks since her arrival, she had been burning wet cottonwood she had managed to cut herself from a stand of trees 1.5 miles away. It smoldered. It smoked. It sulked in the stove and produced more resentment than heat, and she had been feeding it constantly, waking twice each night to add more wood, and still the cabin hovered just above the temperature of misery. The girls slept in their coats. Frost formed on the inside of the window each morning in a thin white lace. The oak was different. It caught from one match. It settled into a burn that was low and even and profoundly confident, as if it had been waiting years for the opportunity to do exactly this. Within an hour, the cabin was warmer than it had been since she arrived. Within 2 hours, June had taken off her coat. That evening, for the first time, both girls slept without shivering, and Willa sat by the stove after they had gone to sleep and felt something she had not felt since the letter arrived about her father. Something close to safe, but oak smoke smells different than cottonwood smoke. Any person who has burned both knows this. It is richer, heavier, with a warmth in the scent that cottonwood does not have. And any person who noticed Willa's chimney putting out that particular smoke, coming from a woman who everyone knew had arrived with no money and no woodpile, would begin to ask questions. The question came 4 days later in the form of Edna Schur. Edna was a widow herself, perhaps 50, who ran the neighboring claim with a competence that the surrounding community acknowledged without quite admiring. She arrived at Willa's door carrying a cloth-covered plate with no particular expression on her face, which was, Willa would learn, how Edna always looked when she was paying close attention to something. She stepped inside. She set the plate on the table. She stood very still for a moment, and then she looked at the stove. "Oak," she said. It was not a question. Willa's heart did not stop, but it considered the option. "My father had some stored before he passed. I found it." Edna's gaze dropped to the floor, which was packed earth covered with rag rugs, then came back up. She did not call Willa a liar. She simply looked at her for a moment with the particular patience of someone who has lived long enough to know when a story has a missing piece. "That's a good stove," Edna said finally. "Draws well." She left 20 minutes later with the plate still on the table. Whatever had been on it was now in a pot on the stove. And she looked back once at the chimney before she turned the corner of the fence. Willa watched her go and understood that the clock had changed. She could not burn the oak openly without raising questions she could not answer. She could not stop burning it without letting the cold back in. And she could not move the wood to the surface in large quantities without someone noticing that the dry well was producing something it had no business producing. She needed to be careful. She needed to be smart. And she needed, more than anything, to keep building her surface pile slowly enough that it looked like ordinary accumulation rather than the evidence of something hidden underground. It was during this careful, exhausting balancing act, hauling just enough, burning just enough, explaining just enough, that Petra found the dog. They had gone to the collection point near the edge of the property where the previous occupant had piled discarded things, broken tools, and rusted tins, and the miscellaneous debris of a life that had moved on. Willa was looking for anything useful. Petra was, as always, looking at everything with the thorough attention of a 6-year-old who believes the world is full of things worth noticing. The dog was behind the pile, large, black-furred, with the lean, careful look of an animal that had been managing on very little for long enough that it had forgotten anything else. It did not growl when Petra approached. It did not run. It simply watched her with amber eyes from a face that had gone very still, the way wild things go still when they are deciding whether to trust something. Petra crouched down in the dead grass. She did not reach out immediately. She simply stayed there at the dog's level, patient and quiet, until the dog lowered its head an inch. Then she held out her hand, palm up, and waited. The dog stretched its neck forward, sniffed her fingers. Then, slowly and with a deliberateness that seemed to cost it something, it pressed its nose into her palm. "He needs us, Mama," Petra said without looking up. "The same way we needed what Grandpa left." Willa looked at the dog. She looked at her daughter. She thought about the additional cost of feeding another mouth through a winter that was already going to require every careful decision she could make. "All right," she said. They named him Soot for the color of him. He ate the scraps from their table and grew incrementally less angular, and within a week he had established, without any discussion, that his job was to sleep in front of the cabin door at night and to be present at the well each morning when Willa hauled. He did not interfere with the hauling. He simply sat near the opening and watched with an alertness that felt, in the cold early mornings, almost like company. He growled the first time Garrett Lund came back. Lund rode up on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after his first visit, when Willa was stacking the morning's wood against the south wall of the cabin. He stayed on his horse and looked at the stack, which was modest but real, and at the smoke coming from the chimney, and at the dog standing stiff-legged between him and the door. "My offer still stands," he said. "Same terms as before. I'm not selling. You've got what? A cord stacked? Cord and a half?" He looked at her hands, at the calluses forming on her palms, at the way she held herself carefully on the side where the shoulder had been troubling her. "You know what this winter takes. I know what I have." Lund was quiet for a moment. He had the patience of someone who had waited out situations before and expected to wait this one out as well. "The offer expires with the first hard freeze," he said. "After that, I'll simply wait and see what spring brings." He rode away. Soot watched him go until he was out of sight, then sat down and exhaled slowly through his nose. It was June who found the slate. She had been playing near the fence line while Willa worked, picking things up and putting them down with the exploratory focus of a 4-year-old conducting important research, and she came back to the cabin holding a flat gray piece of stone the size of her forearm, smooth on one face, roughly edged on the others. She held it up with both hands like an offering. "For my lessons, Mama," she said. Willa took the slate from her daughter's small hands and turned it over. It was a good piece. Flat enough to write on, the right weight for a child to hold. She stood there with it for a moment and felt something tighten in her throat, because June was 4 years old, and they were living on 40 acres of frozen land with $14 to their name, and this child was thinking about her lessons. She pressed her lips together and looked at the fence post and did not let her daughters see her cry. "We'll need chalk," she said, when she could trust her voice again. "Edna might have some," Petra said, with the practical confidence of a 6-year-old who has already been cataloging available resources. Edna did have chalk. She brought it the following week along with a small jar of rendered lard and a bundle of wool yarn, which she exchanged for a wood plane that had been hanging unused on the cabin wall. Willa understood the transaction for what it was. The plane was worth perhaps 30 cents, the supplies worth 5 times that, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. There was a particular dignity in being helped this way, in the pretense of commerce that allowed both parties to keep their footing. Edna sat at the table for a few minutes after the exchange and looked at the slate where June was practicing letters. Then she said, without preamble. The school teacher in town passed through last week. She said she might be looking for a family to board with come spring if the Halverson place falls through. It was not an offer of help. It was information, offered plainly, which is sometimes the same thing. "Thank you," Willa said. Edna nodded once and left. What would you have done in her place? Hauling wood alone? Keeping a secret underground? Raising 2 daughters in a cabin smaller than most people's front rooms? And still, the slate, the chalk, the lessons. What would you have chosen when everything was already so heavy? It was Callum Wren who first came to look at the roof. He arrived one morning without particular announcement, a tall man in his early 40s with the kind of face that has been weathered into something steadier than it was before, and he said he had heard the roof on the old Voss place might need looking at before the serious snow came. He said it the way people say things they have decided are simply true, which left very little room for argument and a fair amount for gratitude. He was on the roof for an hour. When he came down, he said the back corner was loose and he had fixed it, and that the stovepipe flashing needed resealing and he had done that too, and that he would come back if anything else showed itself. Willa offered to pay him. He said he would take a cup of coffee if she had it. She did, barely, and she made it, and they drank it at opposite ends of the table, while June showed him her letters on the slate, and Petra asked him 17 questions about roof construction, to which he answered each one with the patience of someone who finds the questions reasonable. He came back 4 days later with a small sack of nails and a look at the window frame that had been letting in cold around the lower edge. June had his coat hem in her fist within 3 minutes of his arrival. He did not appear to notice or appeared to accept it as reasonable, which came to the same thing. Willa did not look at him directly during either visit. She was not sure why, or perhaps she was sure and simply did not have the space for it yet. In those weeks of careful hauling and careful burning and careful silence, she learned the rhythm of the vault. The wood near the door was the oldest. Her father had stacked it first, years before, and it was drier than dry, cured to a density that made each piece feel heavier than its size suggested. The wood in the back was newer, relatively speaking, added over the final seasons her father had been well enough to work. She hauled from the front and left the back undisturbed, the way you save the best of something for when you will need it most. She learned the pulley by feel. The mechanism her father had designed had a particular rhythm, 3 turns of the handle for every foot of lift, with a slight resistance at the halfway point where the rope crossed the upper wheel at an angle. Once she understood the rhythm, the hauling became almost meditative, a physical conversation with something her father's hands had made, a dialogue conducted in rope and weight and the slow turning of the wheel. Some mornings, descending the ladder in the gray pre-dawn, she found herself talking to him. Not dramatically, not the way people talk to the dead in stories, with weeping and declarations. Just the ordinary speech of someone who has information they want to share. The kind you reach for before you remember the other person is gone. She would notice something, a technique for seating the sling that reduced the load shift, a way of stacking the surface pile that shed snow more efficiently. And she would think, "Father, look." And then the silence that followed was not quite empty. She did not tell anyone about this. She thought it might concern people who did not understand that grief has its own practical architecture. Petra was learning to read by lamplight. This was something that had not been planned but happened anyway, the way important things happen. because the circumstances required it and the person in question was ready. There were 3 books in the cabin, left by a previous occupant or perhaps her father's own sparse library. A Bible, a volume of agricultural advice printed 20 years earlier and already partly obsolete, and a thin collection of verse that had been read so many times the binding had separated from the spine. Petra approached all 3 with equal seriousness. She worked through the agricultural volume first because it had the most pictures, and she asked questions about every term she didn't understand. And Willa answered the ones she knew and said honestly when she didn't know, which Petra appeared to find acceptable. The verse she saved for evenings, reading aloud in a careful voice while June drew shapes on the slate, and Soot arranged himself in front of the stove with the considered deliberateness of a dog who has identified the warmest spot and intends to remain in it. "Mama," Petra said one evening, looking up from the page, "are we poor?" Willa was at the table, working on the numbers. She put down the pen and looked at her daughter, at the lamplight on her face, at the book open in her small hands, at the way she held the question without apparent anxiety, as a request for information rather than an expression of fear. She looked around the cabin, at the stove burning steadily with her father's oak, at the slate propped against the wall with June's letters chalked across it, at the 2 blankets, Edna's and their own, folded at the foot of the rope bed, at the flour on the shelf and the lard in its jar, and the small remaining portion of coffee she had been rationing since arrival. "No," she said, "we are rich in what matters." Petra considered this with the evaluating patience she brought to most answers. Then she nodded once, as if a preliminary finding had been confirmed, and went back to the verse. June, without looking up from the slate, said, "Grandpa was rich too. He just kept it underground." Willa looked at her 4-year-old daughter for a moment. Then she pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling and composed herself. "Yes," she said, when she could trust her voice. "He did." But the crisis that came next was not about Callum or Edna or the careful daily work of hauling wood and keeping secrets. It came on a morning when the sill of the well shaft had filmed over with the first real frost of the season. Not a heavy frost, just a suggestion of one. A thin glaze on the wooden rungs that caught the early light and looked almost decorative until your boot heel landed on it. Willa's right foot went first. She had her hands on the upper rungs and managed to hold for the first half second, but the shoulder, the same shoulder she had been careful with for 2 weeks, the one that had been aching in a low, persistent way that she had been ignoring because she could not afford not to. The shoulder simply refused. The muscles that should have gripped simply opened. She dropped 8 feet before her left hand caught a lower rung. The impact was not a sound so much as a sensation, a white shock running from her shoulder blade through her neck and down her arm, and she hung there in the cold air of the shaft with both feet dangling and one hand barely holding, and understood very calmly that she was in serious trouble. She climbed back up. It took longer than it should have. She sat on the frozen ground beside the well opening and waited for her vision to clear. Then she went inside and told the girl she had slipped and was fine, and made breakfast left-handed because raising the right arm above the level of her waist produced a result she was not willing to let them see on her face. That evening, she could manage 3 trips instead of 8. The following morning, 3 again. The morning after that, 4 on a determined try that cost her the entire afternoon in stillness by the stove. 8 trips a day kept the surface pile building. 4 trips a day kept it even. 3 trips was losing ground, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but losing. She could not afford to lose ground. Not now. Not with the sky doing what it had been doing all week. That particular shade of gray-white that had no depth to it, that sat on the horizon like something waiting. It was on the 4th morning after the fall that Lund came by again. He did not ride up to the cabin. He simply moved along the track that ran past the eastern fence line, and he was perhaps 60 yards away when he stopped. Willa was at the well opening, working the pulley one-handed. She did not see him until she looked up. He was watching, not moving, not speaking, just sitting on his horse in the thin morning light, watching the rope go over the pulley, watching the canvas sling emerge from the shaft of the well that everyone in the area knew for a fact contained nothing but dirt and disappointment. He watched for perhaps 3 minutes. Then he turned his horse and continued down the track and did not look back. That night, Willa sat at the table after the girls were asleep and looked at the numbers she had scratched on the back of the flour sack, the surface pile, the daily burn rate, the weekly haul capacity with one useful arm, the gap between what she was bringing up and what the cold would eventually require. The numbers were not catastrophic, but they were no longer comfortable. She thought about Lund watching the pulley, about the way he had sat there without speaking, about what a man like that does when he has seen something he doesn't understand and has decided to understand it. He was going to find a way to take this land, and if he found a way before the end of winter, before she could prove up the claim, it would not matter what her father had built. It would not matter what she had survived. The vault would belong to someone else, and the $14 would be gone, and the girls would have nothing. She sat with that for a long time. She thought about Haugen, about Stellan, who was not Haugen, but who had sat at her table with the same certainty and told her the same thing. Go back. She thought about what it would mean to go back, to find a room in a city, to pick up the needle and thread and the careful arithmetic of survival on seamstress wages. It would be hard. It had been hard before. She had done it once, and she could do it again. But the land would be gone, and the vault would be gone, and her father's 7 years would dissolve into the prairie like snow in spring, leaving no trace that he had ever dug there, ever planned there, ever loved her with the particular, inexhaustible patience of a man who knew he was running out of time. She could not do that to him. She could not do that to herself. Then June made a sound in her sleep, just a small sound, a syllable of something, and rolled over and put her arm around Petra's waist, and Petra, without waking, put her hand over her sister's. Willa picked up the pen and wrote a single line beneath the numbers. Not yet. What she did not know, sitting at that table in the thin orange light of a winter evening, was that Lund had not gone home after leaving the fence line. He had ridden to the next property, and the property after that, and by nightfall he had sent a letter to a man in the county seat, a man with the authority to examine homestead claims and the disposition to be sympathetic to the concerns of established landowners. The letter would arrive at its destination in 4 days. The man would arrive at Willa's door in 12, and the sky, which had been gray-white and waiting all week, was already deciding what it was going to do next. Something much larger than anyone in that part of the country had prepared for. Something that would render every current calculation meaningless. But that is a story for what comes next. For now, Willa Voss banked the coals in the stove, checked the door latch, and went to sleep between her daughters with one arm she could not use, and a secret underground and a dog at the door who had, without being asked, made himself responsible for the night. The earth never lies, and her father had known it for a very long time. The man's name was Harwick, and he arrived on a gray morning with a leather satchel and the particular expression of someone who has been given a task and intends to complete it efficiently. He was not unkind. That was almost worse. Unkind men announce themselves clearly, and you know where you stand. Harwick simply introduced himself as a land examiner, showed Willa a document with official-looking seals on it, and asked if he might walk the property. She said yes. There was nothing else to say. He walked for 40 minutes. He made notes in a small book with a pencil he kept behind his ear. He looked at the cabin, at the absence of a plowed field, at the 3 chickens that were all the livestock she had, at the surface woodpile, which was real but modest. He looked at the well, at the oak planks covering it, at the pulley frame above it, and he paused there longer than he paused anywhere else. "You've been using this?" he asked. "It's a storage shaft," Willa said. "My father built it for wood." Harwick wrote something in his book. He did not ask to go down. He simply wrote and closed the book, and told her that a preliminary finding would be submitted within the week and that she would be notified of the determination by post. "What does that mean exactly?" Willa asked. "It means," Harwick said, in the tone of a man who has explained this many times and long since stopped finding it interesting, "that the claim is under review. If the cultivation requirements are not demonstrably met, the claim reverts. You would have 30 days from notification to respond or vacate." He left. His horse's hooves made a neat, methodical sound on the frozen ground, getting quieter, and then gone. Willa stood in the yard for a moment. Soot pressed his flank against her leg. She put her hand on his head without looking down. 30 days. Lund had not tried to buy the land this time. He had found something more efficient. He had sent a man with a satchel and a pencil, and now the land itself was in question. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because she had not done enough of the right things, visibly enough for long enough. She went inside, she sat at the table. Then she heard boots on the step, and Callum Wren came through the door without knocking because he had seen Harwick leave, and he did not look like a man who had come to offer pleasantries. He sat across from her. He put both hands flat on the table. "How much time did he give you?" 30 days from the notification letter. Could be a week before it arrives." Callum nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded when he was working through something. "There's a man I know in the next county," he said. "He understands land law better than most lawyers do. He's helped with situations like this before." "Situations like this?" Willa repeated. Something moved across Callum's face. Not guilt exactly, but the cousin of it. "Lund did this to a woman 3 years ago," he said. "Widow, 2 children, 40 acres he wanted. She lost the claim before she understood she had the right to fight back." A pause. "She was my sister." The fire in the stove made a small settling sound. June was asleep on the rope bed. Petra was at the window, watching something outside with the focused patience she brought to anything that interested her. "There are records," Callum said. "The complaints Lund filed, the dates, the pattern, the same shape, 3 times over. If we get them in front of the right person before your notification letter arrives, It changes the situation." Willa looked at him. She thought about his sister, who had stood in a yard probably not unlike this one, and received a man with a satchel and lost everything anyway. She thought about the women who would come after her. The next widow with the next 40 acres containing something Lund wanted. "Go get the records," she said. Callum left that afternoon. What happened in the 4 days after that was this. Willa hauled wood, taught lessons on the slate, mended the gap in the east fence with wire and determination, and tried to do all of it in a way that looked like the ordinary life of a woman improving her homestead, in case anyone was watching. Edna came once with a pot of beans and stayed long enough to ask, without asking, whether there was anything she needed. Willa said no, and meant not yet. The sky, during those 4 days, was doing something. It was difficult to name exactly. The color was not quite right, not the deep steel blue of ordinary winter cold, but something yellower and flatter, like the sky had lost depth and become a surface rather than a distance. The light fell at an angle that left no shadows. The air had a pressure to it, a weight that was not quite wind and not quite stillness. Soot felt it first. He had always been a calm dog, going about his guardian duties with a steady, unhurried competence that matched his size. But on the 3rd day after Harwick's visit, he stopped sleeping through the night. He would circle the inside of the cabin for an hour, lie down, rise again, go to the door, turn back. His nails made a quiet sound on the packed earth, a rhythmic unease that woke Willa twice and then kept her awake, lying in the dark, listening to the dog pace and trying to name what she was feeling in the air. Her father had told her once about the storms that came to this kind of country. He had described them not as weather events, but as things with intention, as if the season itself had decided to make a point. He said the animals always knew before the glass dropped. He said the sky turned a particular color that was not quite any color you could name, and that when you saw it, you should already be inside. She was looking at that color now. On the 4th morning, she went to every neighboring property within walking distance. She went to Edna first, because Edna listened without her face changing. She told her what she believed was coming. Not a regular snowfall, not a seasonal cold snap, but something larger than either of those words suggested. She told her to make sure her wood was inside, her animals secured, her water containers filled before nightfall. Edna looked at the sky for a long moment. Then she said, "You sound like your father." "I know. He was right more often than anyone gave him credit for." "I know that too," Willa said. She went to 3 other properties after that. At 2 of them, she was listened to with the polite half-attention that people give to warnings they have not yet decided to take seriously. At the 3rd, the man repairing his fence told her that restless animals did not predict weather, and that she ought not to borrow trouble when she had plenty of her own already. She went to the general store because it was where people gathered and where, if she was going to be heard by more than one family at a time, it would happen there. Lund was there. She had not known he would be. He was standing by the stove with 2 other men, and when she came through the door with the cold air behind her, he turned and looked at her with an expression that lived somewhere between contempt and amusement. She said what she had come to say. She said it plainly, without drama, the way her father had always spoken about things he knew to be true. The storm signs she had seen were not ordinary. The animals were telling anyone willing to listen that something serious was coming, and serious meant preparation, and preparation meant now. When she finished, Lund looked at the two men beside him, a slow smile, not large, just enough. "The well woman," he said to no one in particular, "is frightened of clear skies." The men beside him laughed, not loudly, just enough. She heard the word folly, and she heard her father's name, and then she was back outside in the yellow-gray afternoon, with the door closed behind her, and the sound of low laughter fading into the cold. She walked home. She did not cry. She was past the point where humiliation could afford its own energy. She walked home and brought the last of the surface wood inside and filled every container she had with water from the creek while the creek could still be reached. And she made sure Callum's nails in the window frame were fully seated, and she checked the stovepipe twice, and she cooked a pot of beans and a pot of cornmeal and left them covered on the stove. Then she sat down and looked at the door, at the rope tied to its frame, the other end of it staked into the earth beside the well cover, a lifeline she had put in place 2 weeks earlier, and that she had been hoping she would never need to use. The storm came at nightfall. It did not announce itself the way smaller storms did, with a gradual darkening and a first scattered fall of snow. It arrived the way something arrives when it has already made its decision. All at once, fully formed, the wind striking the cabin walls like a physical blow that rattled the window in its frame and sent a thin, cold draft across the floor that reached Willa's ankles from 10 feet away. Within an hour, the sound outside was not wind. Wind is a simple thing. It moves, it pushes, it passes. This was different. This was a sustained, layered screaming that had harmonics in it, that rose and fell not with the randomness of weather, but with something that felt, at its worst moments, almost like intention, like the storm was looking for a way in and working through its options methodically. The cabin held. The oak in the stove burned steady and low, throwing heat with a reliability that Willa had come to trust the way she trusted few other things. The temperature inside did not drop. It wavered in the worst gusts when the cold pushed through the walls, but the stove answered each wavering with a quiet, even warmth that reset the room and held it there. Outside, she knew, it was a different calculation entirely. The temperature was dropping in a way that had nothing careful about it, not the slow, managed descent of an ordinary winter night, but something steep and committed, the kind of cold that does not negotiate, the kind that reaches inside walls, inside coats, inside the spaces between heartbeats, and begins to change the conditions of things. She had 27 pieces of oak inside the cabin. She had counted them when she came in with the last of the surface wood, and she had counted them again after supper, and the number was what it was. At the burn rate she was maintaining, steady, responsible, 27 pieces would last perhaps 18 hours, possibly 20 if she was careful. And then Petra began to cough. It started small. The kind of cough that children have sometimes, a clearing sound, the throat reasserting itself. Willa heard it over the wind and filed it, went back to watching the stove. It came again, and again. And then Petra turned over on the rope bed and made a sound that was not a cough at all, but something softer and more worrying, and Willa crossed to her and put the back of her hand against her daughter's forehead. Hot. Too hot. A fever, real and committed, the kind that meant the body was fighting something and burning resources to do it. A fever needed warmth. Every mother in that country knew it. Cold was the enemy of recovery. Cold let the fever win. If she burned at her careful rate, 18 hours, maybe 20. If she burned hot enough to give Petra what she needed, 12, possibly 10. She fed the stove. She fed it without calculating further, because there was nothing to calculate. There was a sick child, and there was a stove, and there was a decision that was not, in the end, a decision at all. She built the fire up until the stove radiated heat she could feel standing 3 feet away, and she got Petra upright and helped her drink a little water and wiped her face with a damp cloth and sang the song her mother had sung to her, the one she only remembered in pieces, the low and unhurried melody that had no particular meaning except that it was familiar, and familiar things help. June woke at some point and lay still without speaking, watching her mother take care of her sister with the gravity of a 4-year-old who understands that this moment requires stillness. Willa sang until Petra's breathing settled. Then she sat by the stove in the dark and read her father's letter again. She had read it so many times that she no longer needed the light. She knew every word. She knew the way his handwriting changed direction slightly at the bottom of the page, where his hand had been tired. She knew the pressure of the pen, how it lightened in the middle and deepened again at the end, as if he had gathered himself for the final line. The well holds what you need. Trust what I built. But she had been reading it wrong. Or rather, she had been reading the surface of it and not what lay beneath. She thought about the lamp burning at the well in the middle of the night. Neighbors had mentioned it to her in the early weeks. Not unkindly, just as curiosity. He would be down there for hours sometimes, they said. 2 in the morning. 3 in the morning, the lamp going in the shaft. They thought he had lost his sense of time along with his sense of what the well was for. He had not lost anything. He had known his heart was weakening. She understood that now, looking back at his letters with the understanding she had not had when she received them, the way he had described his progress in the vault not with the enthusiasm of a man who expected to finish, but with the careful specificity of a man afraid of running out of time. The exact number of cords stored, the dimensions of the chamber as it expanded, the condition of the timber shoring, details that would mean something to someone who needed to use it, someone who was not him. He had been writing instructions in the language of ordinary letters, in the way fathers write to daughters. But underneath the ordinary language was the thing he had not been able to say plainly. I know I will not see this through. I am building this for you because I will not be here to protect you myself, and this is the only protection I know how to make. The last sentence. The thing she had read 100 times and understood for the first time only now. I am sorry I could not stay, but I stayed as long as I could. He had stayed, in the only way available to him. He had stayed in the vault, in the wood, in the careful engineering of a door that balanced on its hinges so that one hand could open it. He had stayed in the pulley mechanism and the canvas sling and the 28 rungs of the ladder, each one set at the same interval, each one tested to hold weight. He had stayed in the space between what he could do and what she would need, and he had filled that space with everything he had. Willa folded the letter. She held it against her chest for a moment. 8 pieces of oak remaining. She had been so deep in the letter that she had not tracked the burn rate, and now she did. And the number was not 18 hours, and it was not 12. It was perhaps 5. 5 hours of fuel, and the storm showed no sign of anything but continuation. and Petra's fever had steadied but not broken, and the wind outside was doing what it had been doing for hours, finding the walls, working at them, looking for a way through. She could wait. She could stretch the 8 pieces to 6 hours, let the room cool, and hope the fever did not use the cold against Petra. Or she could go. She thought about what her father would have done. She thought about 7 years of digging in the dark, of hauling rock and fitting stone and descending a ladder in the small hours of the morning for no reason anyone could see. She thought about the rope he had left tied to nothing. There had been a hook set into the cabin door frame when she arrived, a simple iron hook at shoulder height that she had assumed was for hanging coats. She understood now that it was for a rope. He had known she might need to follow a line into the white. He had put the anchor in place years before she arrived. That was the thing about preparation. It happened before you knew you needed it. It happened in the dark, without witnesses, on the strength of love alone. She looked at the rope tied to the door frame. The other end was somewhere out there in the white, staked beside the well cover, invisible and frozen and absolutely present. She had put it there because her father had understood that planning happens before the need, not during it. He had built the vault before she needed it. He had laid the pulley before she could use it. He had written the letter before she could read it and understand what it meant. She stood up. She put on everything she had. 2 dresses, the wool coat, her father's coat over it, 3 pairs of socks inside boots that gripped her feet like closed fists. She wrapped her face in the longest scarf she owned, leaving only her eyes. She pulled the mittens on over her gloves and looked at her daughters. Petra was sleeping, breathing with the even, committed rhythm of a fever that was working. June had her eyes open. She looked at Willa with the amber steadiness of a child who has decided not to ask questions because she already understands the answer. "I'll be back," Willa said. "Feed the stove 1 piece while I'm gone, but only 1. June nodded. She was 4 years old. In a story, this would be the moment a mother would reconsider, would weigh the risk against the alternative, would search for some third option she had overlooked. But Willa was not in a story. She was in a cabin in the dark with 8 pieces of oak remaining and a sick child, and a vault 20 feet away in the white. There was no third option. There was only the rope. Willa opened the door. The cold came through the gap like something that had been waiting. It found her face above the scarf. It found the gap at her wrists where the mittens met the coat sleeves. It found her eyes and made them water immediately, and the tears began to freeze before they reached her cheeks. She found the rope. She gripped it with both hands, the right still weaker than the left, the shoulder still speaking its particular language of objection. And she stepped off the step into the white. She could not see the ground. She could not see the fence. She could not see anything except the rope in her hands, and the whiteness. It disappeared into 6 inches ahead of her. The wind hit her broadside with every step, not pushing her back, but trying to push her sideways. And she had to lean into it at an angle that felt wrong and was the only way to keep moving. She counted steps, 1 to 10, 10 to 20. She should have been at the well by 15. She was at 20 and still moving, still holding the rope. And she thought for 1 clear, cold second that the rope had come loose from the stake, that she was following it into open country with nothing at the end. Then her boot hit the planks. She knelt. She found the padlock by feel, took her mitten off and found the key in her coat pocket and fit it into the lock. Her bare hand was already hurting. Not the dull ache of ordinary cold, but the sharp, specific pain of something that means business. The lock was frozen. The key turned halfway and stopped. She hit the lock with the heel of her hand. Once, twice. On the third strike, it opened. She pulled the planks aside and found the first rung of the ladder, and she went down. The change in the air was almost violent in its contrast. The screaming of the storm above, and it was screaming by now, a layered, sustained sound that had left weather behind and become something elemental. All of it cut away the moment she was 10 feet down. The shaft held still air, and as she descended, the temperature softened, degree by degree, the way it always did, as if the earth were keeping its promise. She stepped off the last rung. She pressed the false stone. The door swung open. Inside the vault, the air was perhaps 50 degrees, the same temperature it had always been, steady, indifferent to the catastrophe above, keeping its single condition without effort or drama. The oak was stacked where it had always been stacked. Her father's work, patient and quiet in the lampless dark. She could not see. She did not need to see. She loaded the sling by feel. She worked with hands that were returning to themselves in the warmth, fingers relearning their grip. And she packed the canvas with as much wood as she thought she could pull to the surface in one trip. Perhaps 60 pounds. She knotted the cord and dragged it to the ladder. She stayed in the vault longer than she should have. Not resting. She could not afford to rest, but simply existing for a moment in the warmth her father had built. In the 50-degree air that had held its temperature through decades of seasons without being asked to, simply because the earth is faithful to its own laws in a way that human beings struggle to match. She breathed. She let her hands close and open. She thought, "Father, look." Then she climbed. Climbing up was different than climbing down. Going down, the body uses its own weight as a tool. Going up, the body argues with the weight, and the 60 pounds of oak below her argued back through the pulley rope, and her right shoulder began to revisit its position on the matter as the cold returned. She counted 28 rungs going up. She made it to 12 before her right hand had to come off the rope entirely and grip only the ladder. She made it to 20 before the wind above, which she could hear now, reached down into the shaft and reminded her what was waiting. At the surface, the storm took her again. She rolled over the lip of the shaft onto the snow beside it and lay there for a moment because she did not have the option of not lying there. She reached for the winch handle, found it, and turned it, slowly, with both hands, her body weight helping when the right arm suggested it might need a moment, until the sling emerged from the shaft and sat on the snow beside her. She grabbed the rope and pulled the sling behind her. She found the door of the cabin by the light under it, which was barely visible but present, the single piece of oak that June had fed the stove, burning faithfully in there, doing exactly what it had been asked to do. Willa hit the step wrong and went down on one knee and pushed herself up and through the door and into the warmth. June was standing by the stove in her nightgown with her arms crossed over her chest, watching the door with an expression that was too old for her face. When Willa came through, something in her daughter's expression let go, very quietly, and she sat back down on the bed and pulled the blanket over herself without a word. Willa fed the stove. She fed it until the heat was doing what it needed to do, until Petra's face had the flush of fever but not the gray of cold, until the room was warm enough that a person inside it could not hear the storm quite as clearly. Then she sat down on the floor beside the stove and did not move for some time. Petra's fever broke in the early hours of the morning. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, but Willa felt it when she touched her daughter's forehead. The difference between burning and merely warm, the body having completed its work and standing down. She pulled the blanket up to Petra's chin and sat back. The storm was still going. She thought about the 12 hours she had not yet gotten through, and the uncertain number of hours the storm still had in it, and the careful arithmetic of what she had and what she needed and what she could do. Then Soot raised his head. His ears went forward. He was looking at the door. Willa listened. Under the storm, underneath the layered noise of wind and cold, a sound that was different from all of it. Quieter, more deliberate. Someone was knocking. She opened the door. The woman standing on the other side was not someone Willa had expected. She had expected no one, or she had expected a stranger, some anonymous figure separated from shelter by circumstance and bad luck. She had not expected Marta Lund. Garrett Lund's wife was a tall woman, perhaps 45, with a face that had been handsome once and was now something better than handsome, specific, particular, marked by weather and decision in ways that made it interesting to look at. Willa had seen her at the general store twice and exchanged nothing beyond a nod, because there was no version of their situations that made easy conversation possible. Marta Lund was standing on Willa's step in the full force of the storm, holding her son against her chest with both arms. The boy was perhaps 3 years old. His lips had gone the pale blue of something that has been cold too long, and his eyes were open but not quite focused, and his small hands, where they gripped his mother's coat, had lost their color entirely. Marta did not speak. She looked at Willa with an expression that had passed through pride and come out somewhere on the other side of it. Not humble exactly, but emptied, the way a person looks when they have spent everything they had on getting to a door and have nothing left for what happens after. Willa stepped back from the doorway. "Come in. Get warm." Nothing else. No accounting for what had passed between their households. No inventory of grievances. No conditions attached. Just the door, open, and the warmth behind it. And a woman who needed both. Marta came in. She went directly to the stove without being directed, because the stove was what mattered. And she held her son close to it, and pressed her cheek against the top of his head and stood very still while the heat began its work. Willa got a blanket from the chest at the foot of the bed and wrapped it around them both. Then she put the kettle on without asking, because there was nothing to ask. The boy's name was Tobias. Willa learned this later. In those first minutes, he was simply the child, still and pale, and beginning, very slowly, to return to himself in the heat. Soot approached him once Marta had sat down on the floor near the stove. The dog did not ask permission. He circled once and then lowered himself directly beside the boy, pressed his warm flank against the small, cold body, and stayed. Tobias did not react at first. He sat in his mother's arms with his eyes at a middle distance, still somewhere inside the cold that had claimed him. But Soot did not move. He simply remained, large and warm and present, radiating the particular animal patience that has no equivalent in human behavior. The second knock came perhaps 20 minutes later. This one was Stellan Moore. He came without his hat, which told the story of the journey more plainly than any words would have. The hat was not the kind of thing a man like Stellan lost accidentally. He had lost it to the wind, which meant conditions were worse than even Willa had calculated. His hands were stiff at his sides. When she took his arm to pull him through the door, his fingers did not close on her coat the way hands normally do. They pressed flatly, because the joints were not yet making decisions of their own. She sat him near the stove on the other side from Marta and put his hands between hers and held them. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Not dramatically, not with the theater of a man having a revelation, but quietly, the way a window looks different when the light behind it changes. He did not speak yet. The cold had taken his words for the moment, and he let the stove have them back at its own pace. The third knock was a family, a husband and wife, and their daughter, perhaps 8 years old, from a property 2 miles west. The husband had a cut above his eye from something that had come loose in the wind. The wife was holding herself together with the focused care of someone who has decided not to fall apart until later, which is its own kind of courage. The daughter was carrying a cloth bundle that turned out to contain a small braided rag doll, 2 apples, and a portion of dried beef. The things the child had decided mattered enough to bring. After them came a man Willa knew only slightly, a bachelor farmer who lived alone and had always seemed entirely self-sufficient, appearing at her door with snow packed into the folds of his coat, and an expression of bewildered humility that sat oddly on a face accustomed to certainty. He was the one who had told her, at the general store, that she ought not to borrow trouble when she had enough of her own. He did not mention this. She did not mention it either. 13 people in a cabin built for 3. Willa moved through the logistics without stopping to feel them. She pulled the rope bed away from the wall and turned it on its side to divide the room into sections, giving each family a territory. She took the flour sacks from the shelf and made a thick porridge that was not enough for 13 people to eat well, but was enough for 13 people to eat. And she handed it out in the 2 bowls and 3 mugs and 1 tin plate that she had, and people passed them around without discussion. June moved through all of it with a competence that should not have been possible for a 4-year-old, and was. She carried the mugs when they needed carrying. She sat with Tobias Lund when his mother needed to stand and warm her hands properly. She did not ask for anything, and did not complain about anything, and at one point brought the rag doll's owner, the 8-year-old girl, over to the corner where Petra was resting and introduced them with the gravity of someone conducting important social business. Petra, despite the fever that had broken only hours earlier, found the energy to show the girl her slate. They sat together over it for a long time. Willa kept the stove fed. She had made 4 more trips to the vault during the remaining dark hours of the storm's worst, each one a negotiation with the cold and the rope and the shoulder that had opinions about being used this way. She had built a substantial stack inside the cabin now, arranged in rows along the wall where it could be reached without going outside. The oak burned the way it always burned, steady, reliable, deeply indifferent to the chaos happening around it. Every hour the room held its temperature. Every hour the contrast between the cabin and the storm outside was exactly as profound as it had been the hour before. The husband with the cut above his eye said something to his wife that Willa did not catch, but she saw the wife look at the stove, then at the wood stacked along the wall, then at Willa, and the expression on her face was not complicated. The second night, when the storm had reduced itself from screaming to a sustained, committed howl, Stellan Moore spoke. He had recovered his voice by then. He had recovered his hands, which he kept checking, opening and closing them near the stove. The left hand with its missing 2 fingers moving more stiffly than the right, the old frostbite damage asserting itself in the cold. He sat across from Willa with a cup of weak coffee between his palms, and he looked at the stacked wood, and then at her, and then he said it. I told you the cold didn't care about stubbornness. He turned the cup in his hands. I was wrong about one thing. It cares very much about preparation. And your father prepared better than any of us ever knew. He paused. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped. My wife died of fever 12 years ago. Before I understood what preparation really meant, not just food in the cellar, but heat. Certainty of heat, when everything outside is trying to take it away. He looked at the stove. Your father understood that. I'm still learning it. The room was not entirely quiet. The wind was still making itself known through the walls, and somewhere behind the partition of the rope bed, a child was making small, half-asleep sounds. But the people nearby heard him. Willa felt them hear him. She did not say anything for a moment. She looked at the fire, at the square of light visible around the door of the firebox, at the even orange certainty of it. He prepared for a long time, she said finally. Years. Alone. She looked up at Stellan. He knew he might not be there when I needed it, so he made sure I had it anyway. Stellan nodded once, and it was the nod of a man who was also thinking about the people who will come after him, about what it means to love someone by doing difficult things before they know they need them. Soot had not left Tobias. This was the thing Willa noticed most across those long hours. The dog had made his decision in the first 20 minutes and had not revisited it. He lay beside the boy with the settled permanence of something load-bearing, something structural, as if he understood that the boy needed a particular kind of weight against his side, and had appointed himself to provide it. Tobias had not spoken since arriving. He ate when food was offered. He followed directions. But he moved through it all from a distance, from somewhere behind his eyes that was not quite here. And no one pushed him, because everyone in that room had seen cold do that to a person, and understood that the way back was not through force, but through time. On the second night, when the wind had become something that could be talked over rather than talked through, Soot shifted. He did not leave, but he moved his head to rest it on Tobias's knee. The weight of it, not large, just present, just specific and warm, seemed to find something. The boy raised his hand. Slowly, with the deliberateness of someone performing an action they are not entirely sure they are capable of, he placed it on top of the dog's head. His fingers moved, not much, a slight curling. Then he whispered something. No one else heard it except Soot, whose ear flickered in response, and Marta Lund, who was close enough that she heard the breath of it even if she couldn't catch the words. Whatever it was the first thing Tobias had said since the storm began. Marta turned her face toward the wall. Her shoulders moved once. She did not turn back for some time. Willa looked away quickly, because this was not a moment that needed witnesses. She looked at the stove instead. She thought of her father loading the vault in the dark, piece by piece, cord by cord, his lamp throwing shadows on the stone walls, the seasons changing above him without his participation because he was down there working on the thing that needed doing. She thought of the patience of it, not the sacrifice, though it was that, but the patience, the willingness to do a thing for 7 years that no one would see, for someone who would not understand it until she needed it. That was what love looked like when it had nowhere else to go. It looked like split oak in a dry well. It looked like a pulley mechanism and 28 rungs, and a door that balanced so perfectly that one hand could open it. She was still thinking about this when Callum came through the door. He came in the way a person comes through a door when they have been in conditions that make the door feel miraculous, with a controlled care that takes nothing for granted, one hand still on the frame for a moment after the rest of him was inside, as if making sure the threshold was real. His face was windburned to the color of old brick. His coat was crusted at the collar and cuffs with ice that had formed from condensation. He looked around the room, at the 13 people arranged in the space, at the children near the stove, at Marta Lund in the corner with her boy, and his expression did the thing it sometimes did when he was processing something larger than he had planned for. He found Willa across the room. She was sitting on an upturned bucket near the east wall, which was the only place left to sit. She suspected she looked like a person who had made 4 trips to an underground vault in the middle of a violent storm and had not slept in the better part of 2 days. But whatever it was apparently sufficient, because when Callum looked at her, his face lost its processing expression and became something simpler. He came through the room, stepping carefully around the sleeping family, around Soot and Tobias, around June, who was asleep, sitting up against the wall with her head tipped sideways at an angle that would cost her something in the morning. He lowered himself to the floor beside Willa, his back against the wall, and said nothing for a while. They both looked at the room. "How many trips to the well?" he said finally. "4 in the worst of it. 2 more before that." He looked at her right shoulder without making it obvious that he was looking. "How is it?" "Functional," she said. He accepted this. He was not the kind of man who pushed when functional was the answer given. "The records came through," he said. 3 prior complaints filed by Lund. Same pattern each time. Documentation going back years. The right person has seen them. Harwick's authority on this claim has been suspended pending review. Willa was quiet for a moment. "You did that before the storm," she said. Not a question. 2 days before. He paused. "I wasn't sure if it would be enough. I'm still not entirely sure. But documented patterns have a way of changing the conversation." The fire shifted in the stove. A log settled, readjusting, releasing a small breath of additional heat. Around them, the people of the surrounding homestead slept and breathed and held their children and recovered, slowly, from what the storm had done to them. Callum reached over and put his hand on top of hers. He did it the way he did most things, without announcement, without making it into more than it was. Just his hand, warm from the stove's proximity, resting on her cold one. Still, present. She did not move her hand. There was nothing that needed saying. Outside, the storm was doing the thing that storms eventually do, declining, not stopping yet, but withdrawing from its worst positions, the wind dropping by degrees, the sound changing from that sustained, furious howl to something more intermittent. The walls of the cabin stopped shuddering. The draft at the base of the door became something that could be managed with a rolled cloth rather than something that had to be endured. When news came, midway through the second morning, it arrived in the form of a report passed from family to family as each one woke and began to account for the night. Garrett Lund had gone out the second night. He had gone, apparently, to check on his horses, the expensive ones he had kept separate from the ordinary working stock. He had gone out alone, in the worst of it, and had been found some hours later by his own farmhand. He was alive, barely and narrowly, in the way that people are alive after they have been somewhere very cold for very long. Present in the body but still reconciling with it. His hands had suffered for it. Not entirely, not permanently, but enough. Willa heard this and said nothing. She thought about Lund standing at the general store with his slow, comfortable certainty, telling the room that the well woman was frightened of clear skies. She thought about his sister, Callum's sister, who had lost 40 acres and left before she knew she had the right to fight back. She did not feel satisfaction. She had expected to, in some theoretical version of this moment, and she did not. She felt instead a complicated, unresolved sadness. The sadness of someone who understands that consequences arrived, and that arriving consequences do not undo the things that made them necessary. Lund's hands would heal, partially. Callum's sister's land was still gone. Justice, she thought, is not the same as repair. She got up and fed the stove. By the afternoon of the second day, the storm had finished. The wind died in the space of perhaps an hour, and the sky went from white to a pale, exhausted gray. And then, before dark, a line of clear, deep blue appeared at the western horizon, and sat there, improbable and clean, like a promise that the world had remembered what it was supposed to look like. People began to stir with the intention of leaving. There was a collective, unspoken acknowledgement that the emergency had resolved, that the people who had arrived in Willa's cabin as strangers or adversaries or both would now return to being neighbors, in whatever complicated sense that word was going to mean going forward. In the morning light that came through the window, thin and pale and enormously welcome, the cabin looked different than it had in the dark of the storm. Smaller in one sense, because the daylight revealed the dimensions plainly. Larger in another, because of what it had held. 13 people, 2 days, a fire that had not gone out. Willa moved through the small remaining logistics of departure, the way she had moved through everything since arriving on this claim. Methodically, without ceremony, attending to what needed attending to and setting aside what could wait. She heated the last of the cornmeal into something that resembled porridge and passed it around, and people ate standing up or sitting on the floor, because the chairs were occupied by a sleeping child and a man whose feet had swollen from the cold and needed to stay elevated. The family from 2 miles west, Roy, his wife, and the 8-year-old girl with the rag doll, had been the quietest guests. They had occupied their assigned corner of the cabin with a self-containedness that Willa had initially read as coldness, and later understood as the particular dignity of people who are deeply embarrassed by needing help. The wife, whose name turned out to be Clara, had washed all the mugs without being asked, using water from the kettle, and had folded the blanket they had borrowed into a square so precise it looked almost ceremonial. Before she left, Clara paused at the door and turned back. She looked at Willa with an expression that had something of the same quality as Marta Lund's. The look of someone who has arrived at a truth and is deciding how much of it to say aloud. "We told Roy's brother last autumn he was foolish for building a root cellar so deep," she said. "Told him nobody needed to go down that far for vegetables." She picked up her daughter's hand. "I think perhaps we were wrong about that." "Come in spring," Willa said. "I'll show you what my father knew." Clara nodded once, and they went. The husband with the cut above his eye stopped at the door. He looked back at Willa and said, "I want to know how that vault works. What I need to build one." Willa nodded once. "When the ground thaws, bring your brother if he's willing." He looked at her for a moment, something shifting in his expression, the last of the embarrassment giving way to something simpler. Then he nodded and went. The bachelor farmer left without speaking, but he stopped at the wood stack and looked at it for a moment, and something about the way he looked at it suggested he was not finished thinking about it. Marta Lund was the last to go. She dressed Tobias carefully, wrapping him in the extra blanket Willa had set aside for him, and she stood in the middle of the small cabin with the expression of someone who has arrived at a thing they need to say and is determining the right form for it. "I knew," she said, "about the Hartley woman, about the others. I told myself it was his business, that I didn't know enough to judge." She paused. "I knew enough." Willa looked at her. She thought about what to say and decided on the truth. "I know." Marta nodded once. She picked up Tobias. At the door, the boy looked back over his mother's shoulder at Sud, who was sitting up and watching them go with the alert, attentive expression of someone seeing off company. Tobias raised one small hand. He held it there for a moment. Not quite a wave. Something more deliberate than that. A gesture of recognition, of acknowledgement. Then they were gone. The cabin was quiet, and Willa stood in the middle of it with her daughters and her dog and the warmth of a fire that had not gone out, and she looked at the life her father had made possible, and she held it. Callum had stayed. He was at the window, looking out at the line of blue on the western horizon that was widening now as the storm retreated. He simply stood there and let the quiet be what it was. Then June tugged his sleeve and held up the slate with her letters on it. He sat down and looked at them with the same serious attention he brought to everything she showed him, and June explained each letter in a voice that suggested she found his unfamiliarity with certain of them gently surprising. Petra laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since the fever, a small and genuine sound, and it moved through the cabin the way warmth moves, not with announcement, but with a change in the quality of the air, something that had been absent now present, something that did not need a name to be exactly what it was. Willa put her hand on the lid of the stove. Warm. Even. Exactly what it had been asked to be. Outside, the blue was still widening, and below the cabin, in the steady dark of the vault her father had built in secret and in love, the oak waited, patient as it had always been, patient as the man who had placed it there, for whatever came next. The world the storm left behind was unrecognizable. Willa stood in the doorway of the cabin on the morning after the blue line appeared, and she looked at it. The land had been rearranged. Drifts stood 8 and 10 feet high in places, sculpted by the wind into shapes that had no correspondence with the terrain beneath them. The fence line had disappeared entirely. The track that ran past the eastern boundary was gone. replaced by an unbroken white surface that gave no indication anything had ever passed over it. The well cover was buried. She knew where it was because she knew the yard, had learned it in the dark with her hands. She went out with the shovel and cleared it while Callum cut a path from the cabin door to the woodshed, and the cold was still serious, but it was honest cold now, the kind that simply required appropriate clothing rather than the kind that had been trying, the night before last, to end things. She dug and she thought about what came next. Stellan Moore came back 3 days after the storm, which was how long it took the track to become passable again. He came with his hat this time, a different hat than the one he had lost, a better one, which suggested something without requiring that anything be said about it. He sat at Willa's table and drank her coffee, and was quiet for a while. "I'd like to see the construction," he said eventually. "The shoring, the depth, how he kept the temperature stable. I'll take you down." She did. She took him through the shaft and through the door, and stood with him in the vault, while he looked at everything with the careful attention of a man who has been building things for 40 years, and recognizes good work when he encounters it. He did not speak for a long time. He walked the perimeter. He pressed his hand against the timber frames. He looked at the air gaps between the stacks, at the way the wood was arranged to allow circulation, at the precise dimensions of the door and the counterweight mechanism that made it possible to open with one hand. "He did all of this alone," Stellan said. "Yes." "And nobody knew." "He knew who to tell," Willa said. "He just couldn't tell her until he was ready." Stellan was quiet for another moment. Then, "I'd like to build something like this, on my property. I have timber already felled that needs a better place to season than a surface pile." Willa looked at the chamber around them, at the timber framing, at the door on its careful hinges, at everything her father had made in the dark. "Then we will do it right," she said. "I know every measurement, every angle. He showed me without knowing he was showing me." Harwick's review resolved itself 10 days after the storm. The letter that arrived contained language that was official and careful and ultimately unambiguous. The cultivation complaint had been found to lack sufficient basis, given documentation of prior similar filings by the same complainant against other homestead claimants. And the claim was confirmed as valid, pending completion of the standard proving up period. Willa read the letter twice. Then she folded it and placed it in the same hidden seam of her father's coat where she had found the key, because it seemed like the right place for things that mattered to be kept. Garrett Lund came on a morning 2 weeks after the storm, when the snow was still deep, but the sky had recovered its proper depth and color. He came alone, on foot, which told her something. His horse was not injured. She had heard from Edna that the horses had survived in their stalls, but he had chosen to walk anyway, perhaps because arriving on horseback felt like arriving with an advantage, and he was not in a position to arrive with advantages. His hands were wrapped, not heavily, not dramatically, but wrapped, and he held them slightly away from his sides in the unconscious way of someone accommodating a hurt they are still learning to live with. He stopped at the edge of the yard. Willa was at the well. She had seen him coming down the track and had continued what she was doing, because there was wood to haul and the morning was not getting warmer. He took in the yard the way a man takes stock of something he has underestimated. The well, the pulley, the smoke from the chimney, the sound of children's voices through the wall. Then he looked at Willa. "Your father," he said, "was smarter than any of us gave him credit for." It was not an apology. It was not a confession. It was an acknowledgement, offered in the particular tone of a man who has arrived at a truth that costs him something and has decided to deliver it plainly rather than dress it up as something else. Willa set down the wood she was carrying. She thought about Callum's sister, who had stood in a yard probably not unlike this one and received a man with a satchel and lost everything anyway. She thought about the women before her and after her, the ones who would have faced the same machinery if Callum had not found the records. She thought about her father, loading oak in the dark, piece by piece, for 7 years. Yes, she said, he was. Lund held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned and walked back down the track, and she watched him until the figure in the snow reduced itself to a point, and then to nothing. Then she picked up the wood and finished the hauling. She stood at the well for a long time after he disappeared. The cold had teeth again, but it was honest cold. She finished hauling the morning's wood. She stacked it by the door. She went inside and made breakfast, and when Petra asked who the man was, she said, "Someone who came to say something that needed saying." Petra accepted this. June did not ask. Some questions, at 4 years old, answer themselves. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel the clean release of something resolved. She felt instead what she had been feeling since the night of the storm. The night she had opened the door to Marta Lund's emptied face and the pale blue lips of a child she owed nothing to. A conviction, quiet and settled, that some things are not about deserving. Some things are simply about what you do with what you have been given. Her father had given her warmth. She had passed it forward. Spring came slowly that year, the way it comes after a severe winter. Not with enthusiasm, but with a kind of cautious return, testing the ground before committing its full weight. The snow receded in stages. The track reappeared. The fence line emerged from the drifts like something remembered. Callum came every few days. He came with nails, with lumber, with the practical justifications that a practical man generates when he intends to be somewhere regularly. He fixed the east fence. He fixed the window that had been admitting cold around the lower frame since before Willa arrived. He built a proper shelf in the cabin for the girls' things. He asked, one afternoon, if Willa had any objection to him digging a kitchen garden on the south side of the cabin, where the soil looked good and the light was right. She said she had no objection. He dug it. June approved of him with a completeness that required no ambiguity. She had decided, in the practical way of 4-year-olds who have made up their minds, that Callum was a permanent feature, and she arranged her behavior accordingly, which meant sitting on his boot when he was trying to work and explaining things to him that he hadn't asked about. Petra was more considered. She watched him with the evaluating attention she brought to most things, and she asked him one afternoon, out of what appeared to be nowhere, but was clearly the conclusion of extended internal deliberation. "Did you know our grandfather?" "No," Callum said. "I wish I had." Petra looked at him for a moment. "He built things that lasted," she said. "Mama says that's the best kind of person." Callum looked at Willa across the garden. "I think she's right," he said. Petra appeared to accept this as sufficient. She went back to her slate. He asked Willa to marry him on an evening in late spring when the air had finally fully committed to warmth and the kitchen garden was showing its first deliberate green. He asked her without ceremony, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, in the way that a question asks itself when it has been waiting long enough. She said yes in the same way, without ceremony, as a continuation rather than an interruption. They married in summer in the yard of the cabin with Edna and Stellan and Roy, the husband whose cut had healed cleanly and whose family had become, in the months since the storm, the kind of neighbors who appear before being asked. June wore a ribbon in her hair that Edna had given her and treated with a reverence appropriate to something precious. Petra read a passage she had copied from a book, standing very straight, in the voice she used for things that mattered. Soot lay in the sun near the well and watched proceedings with the satisfied air of a creature whose household has arrived at the correct configuration. The work of the vault spread the way useful knowledge spreads, not through announcement, but through the visible evidence of its results. Families who had been in the cabin during the storm told other families. Questions were asked. Willa answered them. She drew diagrams on paper and on the back of flour sacks, and once, memorably, in the dust of Roy's barn floor when the right tools were not available, and the question was pressing. The principle was simple, she explained, every time. Dig deep enough to reach the Earth's constant temperature, the layer below the frost line where the seasons stop making decisions. Timber the chamber properly, manage the airflow, store seasoned wood, not green, not half dry. The earth never lies, she told them. It holds a steady temperature at depth, winter and summer. My father understood that. He used what was true about the earth and built something that lasted. Can you share that? Can you take the thing you have been given, the knowledge, the warmth, the key sewn into a coat, and pass it forward without counting what it costs? That is what she did. Every time someone asked, she answered. By the end of that first summer, Stellan had begun excavating. He hired 2 young men to help with the digging and did the timber work himself, because he trusted his own hands on timber above anyone else's. When he lowered the first cord of wood through the shaft and stacked it by lamplight in the even, temperate air below, he stood there for a while before climbing back out. He told Willa later, "Your father understood something I didn't. That preparation is a form of love. That doing the hard thing before it's needed is how you show someone you intend to still be useful to them, even after you can't be present." Willa did not speak for a moment. "He was very patient," she said. Stellan nodded. "That's what I mean." Callum built a proper house in the second year, a house with real walls and a real floor and, through the kitchen, a trap door that opened onto the shaft of Einar's vault. The trap door became one of the ordinary things of their household, the way a cellar door is an ordinary thing, unremarkable in its daily use and remarkable in its history. The girls grew up going down the ladder as naturally as they went through any other door, fetching wood in winter, storing things in summer, bringing friends down occasionally to show them the vault with the proprietary pride of children who understand they live somewhere unusual. Soot died in the summer of the second year. He died in the way that very good dogs die when they are allowed to. At his own pace, on a warm day, in the sun beside the well where he had kept his watch through the winter. He had been slowing for some weeks, with the gradual, undramatic dignity that characterized everything he did. On his last morning, he ate a small breakfast and went outside and lay down in his chosen spot, and did not get up again. Petra and June dug the grave themselves beside the well, close enough to the planks that he would have a position near his post. They were very thorough and very serious about it, the way children are serious about the things that matter. June put a piece of paper in the grave before they closed it. She had written on it in her careful, newly confident letters. The letters practiced on the slate. The letters learned in the cold winter of the cabin. The letters that had begun with a piece of flat stone found at a fence line. Willa did not read what June had written, but she saw the paper, small and folded, placed on the dark fur with the deliberateness of something meant to stay. She understood that some things do not need witnesses to be true. The years that followed arranged themselves the way years do when the foundation is sound, not without difficulty, not without weather, but with the continuity of something that has been built to last. Tobias Lund was one of June's students in those early years of the schoolhouse. He was a quiet boy, deliberate in the way of children who have been somewhere frightening and come back steadier for it. He asked June once why the Voss family had opened their door that night. He was old enough to know the question, young enough to still expect a simple answer. June thought about it for a moment. "Because that's what the wood was for," she said. "Not just for us. For anyone who needed it." Tobias wrote that down in his copybook. He kept the copybook for the rest of his life. Petra grew into a young woman with her grandfather's patience and her mother's precision, and she became the person people brought complicated questions to, not because she always had the answers, but because she understood how to find them. She began, eventually, to write things down. The construction principles of the vault, the signs of weather her father had taught her, the old knowledge her mother had inherited from Einar and passed forward. She wrote them in plain language for ordinary people because knowledge that can only be used by experts is not fully useful. June became the teacher. She had always been the one who explained things. To Callum, to the neighbors' children, to anyone who came through the door of the small schoolhouse that was built when the community grew large enough to need one, she taught the way her mother had taught her, on a slate in a cabin in winter, with the understanding that learning happens in the middle of survival and is none the less real for that. The vault under Willa's cabin became, over the years, a kind of landmark, not famous, not documented in any official way, simply known. The kind of thing that people in the area mentioned to newcomers, not with drama, but with the matter-of-fact respect given to things that have proven themselves over time. "That's the Voss place," they would say. "The one with the underground vault. Einar Voss built it. His daughter survived the bad winter with it, and opened her door to everyone who came. And then she taught everyone who asked." Roy built one the second spring, with Willa's diagrams and Stellan's counsel and his own hands doing the work. His chamber was shallower than Einar's. He did not have the patience for 30 feet of digging, but it reached the right depth for his ground. And when the following winter came, he burned seasoned oak, while his neighbors burned wet cottonwood and spent their nights feeding restless stoves. He brought Willa a jar of preserved plums in October as payment for the knowledge. She told him the knowledge wasn't hers to sell. He left the plums anyway. Clara taught her daughter to read on a proper slate that winter, in a cabin that stayed warm. The daughter grew up and became a teacher herself, and she told the story of the vault to every class she ever taught, not as a lesson in engineering, but as a lesson in patience, in the kind of love that works in the dark for years without credit, because the person it is meant for will need it someday. Edna Schur never built a vault of her own. She had cottonwood enough and a son strong enough to cut it, and she was, at her core, a pragmatist who did not change things that were already working. But she visited Willa's vault 3 times over the years, once out of curiosity, once to show a widow who had arrived in the area with nothing, and once simply to stand in the chamber for a few minutes and think. What she thought about, she never said. Willa did not ask. Some things are private even between friends, and they had become, over time, something close to friends. The vault was never empty. Willa saw to that, and after her, Petra did, and after Petra, the grandchildren took turns. It became one of the household's rhythms. The autumn hauling, the spring counting, the summer seasoning of the year's new wood on the surface before it went below. The ladder was replaced twice. The pulley mechanism was rebuilt once, when the rope finally gave way after more years of service than rope reasonably expects. Callum rebuilt it to the same design because the design was correct and there was no reason to change what was correct. In later years, when Willa sat on the porch of the house that Callum had built and watched the grandchildren move across the yard, she sometimes thought about her father in the shaft. She thought about him at 2 a.m. with his lamp, loading the sling, carrying it up, going back down. One cord, and then another across 7 years of seasons that he did not spend on rest or comfort, or the things men spend their time on when they are not preparing something for someone they love. He was not building for me, she thought. He was building for this, for the yard with children in it, for the smoke from the chimney, for the community that grew from the knowledge he had stored alongside the wood. He was building for the ordinary Tuesday afternoon of a life that continued. One autumn, when the grandchildren were old enough to be curious, the oldest one, a girl of 9 with her great-grandfather's serious eyes, found the false stone on her own. She had been exploring the vault, as children explore things, and she had noticed what Willa had noticed so many years before, the stone that sat slightly proud of the others. She came upstairs and found Willa in the kitchen and said, with the contained excitement of someone who has found something important, "There's a stone down there that moves." Willa looked at her granddaughter. She thought about the brass key, warm from being kept against a chest. She thought about a single sentence in her father's handwriting. "Yes," she said. "Come, I'll show you what's behind it." They went down the ladder together, the old woman and the child, with a lamp between them, into the steady and faithful dark of the vault. Willa pressed the stone. The door swung open, smooth and silent on its hinges, still balanced after all these years. The granddaughter looked through the doorway. She looked at the chamber, at the timber framing, at the way the walls were built and the air moved and the temperature held itself apart from the seasons above. "He built this?" she said. "All of it?" "All of it, alone, over many years. Why didn't he just tell people?" Willa considered the question because it deserved consideration. "He knew what it was worth," she said finally, "and he knew who to tell. He told me the only way he could, by making sure I'd find it when I needed it." The granddaughter was quiet for a moment, looking at the door on its perfect hinges, at the stone walls her great-grandfather had laid in lamplight underground while the seasons changed above him. "Was he patient?" she asked. "The earth never lies, and neither did he." "He was the most patient person I have ever known," Willa said. "And that patience is why you're standing here. Why all of us are standing here." She thought about what patience really meant. Not the gritted teeth endurance that people describe when they are waiting for something difficult to pass. Not the performance of waiting while secretly calculating how much longer it will be. She meant the kind of patience that does not count the hours at all, because it is not waiting for something to end. It is working toward something that has not yet begun. It is digging a shaft in the dark because someone, someday, will need what is at the bottom. That was what her father had. That was what he had passed to her. Not just the vault, not just the key, but the understanding that love sometimes shows itself not in presence, but in preparation. Not in what you say, but in what you quietly, faithfully, without acknowledgement or credit, build. The lamp threw their shadows large against the stone. The vault held its temperature as it had always held it, indifferent to the years, faithful to the single condition its builder had designed it for. The granddaughter reached out and touched the door. She felt the weight of it, the way it moved so easily despite its size, the engineering of a mind that had thought through every possibility before committing. She pushed it open and pulled it closed and pushed it open again. "Will you teach me?" she said. "How it works, how he built it, all of it." Willa put her hand on the door beside her granddaughter's smaller one. The knowledge would travel forward in different ways. In Petra's books, written in plain language for ordinary people who needed it most. In June's classroom, where learning happened in the middle of survival and was nonetheless real for that. In Tobias Lund's copybook, kept a whole life, taken out and read again in old age. In Roy's daughter's yearly telling, every class, every year, the story passed forward like a coal carried from one hearth to light another. Chains of telling and learning and doing and building, extending from a single act of patient love outward through time, in ways that no one person could fully see or follow, but that were real and permanent and would outlast every storm. "Yes," she said, "I will teach you everything." And in the vault her father had filled with love and oak and 7 years of patient preparation, the lamp burned steady, and the temperature held, and the knowledge passed from hand to hand the way it had always passed, from the one who understood it to the one who was ready to learn. If you are sitting somewhere cold right now, if you are carrying something that feels too heavy, if you are wondering whether what you are building will matter to anyone, if you are digging in the dark and no one has asked you why, and you are not sure you could explain it if they did, remember the man who dug in secret for 7 years so someone he loved would be warm. Remember that he never saw the vault filled. He never saw his daughter stand in the chamber and understand what it was. He never saw the storm that his preparation outlasted, or the 13 people who came in from the cold because of what he had built. He did it anyway. That is not folly. That is love, measured in cords. The earth never lies, and neither did he.